wouldn't it be great if there was a more effective way to connect with your target audience or with people that you're trying to sell? Stay tuned, because that's what we're going over today. So back when I was a kid and someone would be talking to my grandfather, they'd tell him something that was exciting or tell him a story or something that he couldn't believe, and he'd say, "Oh wow, great gravy on a housetop." Like, what? What, Grandpa? What are you talking about? But that was just this phrase that was part of who he was. It was part of what was inside of his brain. And he would use that to declare that he's shocked or that something was crazy or what's going on. And he had that phrase, and it was just a part of how his brain was wired at that point. Have you ever noticed people that have those specific words? Maybe you're in a conversation with them and they'll use the same word 4 or 5 times. I used to have a friend that would do that all the time, that if they ever saw something that was crazy, they'd say, "Oh man, that's so dope." Now, if my grandpa had heard someone going around saying that's so dope, he probably was of the generation that he would have thought that that person was saying, "Oh, what a fool," right? Because that generation used dope to mean foolish. My parents, if they had heard it, they were thinking they were talking about drugs. For me and my friends, dope meant cool. So there's all these different meanings for these different words. Now, along with that, we have different subcultures. So while you have these generational words, we also have subculture words. For example, if I were to walk into a room and say there's a dead cat outside, that's going to mean something very specific to a group of people. And most people are going to think that there's a little kitten or maybe an old cat that went out there and died. But if I was talking, and I'm talking to a group of people who are in the audiovisual world, they're going to think of one of these little microphone covers when I say dead cat. Now, if I say dead cat and I'm talking to a group of political analysts, a dead cat is actually a distraction from like a scandal that they don't want you to know about. So they'll send out what they call a dead cat so that it gets your attention and you're thinking about that rather than thinking about the scandal that they're scared of. So then also, a dead cat can also, if I'm talking to the finance world, it can be when the stock market or some other market is in decline and all of a sudden it starts to bounce up again, and that bounce is unsustainable and it heads back down. This moment right here was the dead cat bounce. And so a dead cat can mean a ton of different things to different people. So what does all this have to do with connection? Well, when you know who it is you're trying to connect with, you're going to have a more optimal chance to connect with them if you can speak their language. And here's why that matters. So if we have the human brain, the brain is setting up barriers all around it. And it's difficult for information to make it into the brain. Now within the brain, we've got the 2 primary categories. We've got what I will call the I portion, and that's going to be for intellectual. And then we also have the E portion, or the subconscious or the emotional side. And these 2 work together in tandem. Now, at our conscious level, we're processing a certain amount of data every moment. The subconscious is processing far more data at every moment, and it only allows some of the data from the subconscious to make it up into the conscious brain. So it's important, if most of the data comes in that makes it through the barrier, and I call this barrier is set up by the emotional subconscious part, if it makes it into here and then it's worthwhile, the emotional part will send it up into the intellectual part. A great example of this is if you've ever been driving down the road and someone's sitting in the passenger seat and they're like, "Oh my goodness, did you just see that?" You're like, "See what? I'm driving." And they're like, "Oh, I can't believe you didn't see it. It was right there." But your brain is busy focusing on the road, focusing on the traffic, focusing on your speed, all those things that are important to your brain. And somebody else is having a totally different experience and seeing something totally different. So the trick becomes getting our message, when we're trying to communicate with people, to show up not just at the emotional level, but at the intellectual level. How do we do this? Well, a great example of that was going back to my grandfather, and what in the world was great gravy on a housetop? Who knows what it would look like if you're pouring gravy on a housetop, right? And for him, though, that declaration was something that had been wired into his brain in such a way that he would immediately make it into both the intellectual and the emotional if that phrase was used. So if someone else said that, that would catch his attention. In today's world, we're all being bombarded with different messages all the time. We have this data overload happening. So it's important for us to understand who it is we're talking to and what it is that they care about and what the words that they use. When we understand the kinds of words people use, whether it's a generational word or a subculture word. So for example, going back to dead cat, I'm going to have a very different response if I say dead cat in a financial world than if I say a dead cat in the audiovisual world, or if I say it to the general population. So once I can zero in on these different types of words that my audience is using, which means I have to understand things about my audience. I have to understand things like age. How old is my audience? What generation are they from? Right? Different generations have different words. And then what subcultures? So for example, if I said Davenport, that's going to mean nothing to people who are under 25 unless they live in like Iowa, where there's a Davenport, Iowa. But if I say Davenport in certain parts of the country or in Canada, it might mean something different. A Davenport used to be synonymous with a couch. In today's world, for most people, it's lost that meaning. But if I knew I was advertising to people who were in their 60s to 80s, and I was trying to sell them a couch, I could use the word Davenport and it would immediately trigger something in their brain, most likely because they heard it as a child, and that would have bubbled back from their memory and pull forward. We can do the same thing once we understand our audience. Once we understand what they care about, their subculture, their generation, and the kinds of phrases that they often use to describe something, we can use the same language they're using to communicate back with them. And when we do that, it helps push through the emotional layer that has the barrier that is blocking us from getting to the intellectual layer. And once we do that, we've made it to the conscious mind, and we've built a connection between our message, the emotional layer, the intellectual layer, and at that moment, we've got their attention. So if you're looking for a way to better communicate with your audience, to be able to better connect with them, to be able to better sell them on your concept, your ideas, your hopes, your dreams, or maybe it's just a product, a service, or an offer, understanding their words, using the words they use, and communicating in a way that's going to mean something to them makes all the difference.